The Industrial Revolution changed the world. That much is evident in almost every aspect of our modern lives. We drive cars. Well, at least everyone but the Dutch do. And we go to grocery stores where food is shipped in huge metal carriages from one side of the continent to the other. We use phones that were manufactured, where raw materials were dug up or grown and processed over and over again, built by machines powered by the heating of water and spinning of turbines in most cases. And none of that would have even been possible without the Industrial Revolution. Industrial society changed the way we thought about ourselves in relation to the world and each other. People began to see the world and its vast regions as sources of raw materials and energy to fuel factories, transportation, and growth. Industrialization pulled people into urban centers, fostered a middle class below the former merchant class but above the former peasant class. Work moved outside the home or the farm to factories. We built new concepts of family structures and new ways of relating ourselves to our states and our nations. The world became more productive, more ambitious than ever before. But industrialization wasn't just a linear step in a sequence, a logical conclusion of the growth of civilizations. Industrialization was unique. It was not inevitable, and it was disparate, non-uniform in its seizure of the brilliant minds and nations and resources of the world. The Industrial Revolution is often considered to have begun in Britain around 1760, and it transformed the lush, rolling hills of the British Isles from a relatively rural, agrarian society of landed gentry and peasant farms with a textile industry of cotton processing into an almost living factory, a bastion of mechanized production, urbanization, and economic growth. Britain produced or adopted inventions like James Watt's steam engine, Richard Arkwright's water frame, and Eli Whitney's cotton gin. With these new tools, goods could be mass-produced on a larger scale not ever seen before. The British went from consuming the majority of their output, food, textiles, and coal, to exporting it, selling it in internal markets like their colonies in India, or to Germany or the United States. It became the workshop of the world as turnpikes, canals, and rail networks were constructed, and people moved from the countryside into crowded cities and factories in Manchester and Birmingham. The steam engine, which was originally built to pump water out of mines, was now used to move people. Steamships putted up rivers, and the ground was dug up for coal, peat, and iron. Britain was particularly unique, along with its former colony in the United States, in that they both had an abundance of coal and iron already at home, which were the two main ingredients for the production of steel. Britain's population thus boomed, precipitating a rapid expansion of the British Empire, bringing new markets and resource-rich colonies into their sphere of influence. Even though the population was rising, industrial demand was rising even more, allowing the British to escape the Malthusian trap, wherein population growth precipitates, firstly, a lack of food, but secondly, the driving of wages down. In Britain, many young people would set off to populate the colonies, but even then, the sheer demand actually drove wages up at home, allowing workers to experience a quality of life unimaginably high relative to pre-industrial standards. Of course, today we scoff at the safety standards and hygiene and the way people were packed into cities prone to fire and smog, but to the worker of the mid to late 18th century, he was living like a king compared to his father or grandfather. Right, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but these workers now had access to more food, consumer goods, and eventually leisure than their pre-industrial ancestors. The lowly factory worker of the late 18th and the 19th century ate 3 meals a day and could afford things like tea, sugar, and printed cloth. But it did come with new urban hardships, crowded, filthy, and often dangerous urban environments that most weren't really accustomed to. Now, a major condition that spurred this industrial revolution on was Britain's cultural and governmental history. It had a relatively stable, flexible government that could respond to its people, a culture of responsibility and enterprise, and politicians who had enough of a stake in the improvement of the lives of the common person to not be comically corrupt, incompetent, or out of touch. But, as we alluded to, industrialization didn't happen all at once, nor did it happen the same everywhere. It occurred dynamically across different regions, and in some places industrialization didn't even occur at all. Britain wasn't even the model for every industrial revolution. Of course, in the United States, we see the greatest parallels to the British situation, with Samuel Slater's textile mill in Rhode Island kicking things off, built using smuggled British technology. But uniquely, at least compared to Britain, industrialization in the United States strengthened the slave-based economy of the South, which itself fueled northern textile mills. Slavery has a very interesting role in industrialization, and it's something that's hotly debated even to this day, because it served as both a hindrance and, in specific contexts, a contributor to industrial development. Now, in general, slavery tended to prevent industrialization by suppressing the incentives for technological innovation. Abundant, cheap labor reduced the need for these labor-saving devices that the technology were producing, which we saw in the American South, because in the South, slave-grown cotton provided over 60% of U.S. export earnings by 1850, which thus delayed its industrialization, as the South focused more on raw material production rather than manufacturing. Thus, there was no urbanization, there was less mechanization, because there really was no need to invest in new machines. And we saw the first signs of economic stagnation in the Southern economy, which then led these Northern abolitionists to view slavery as an obstacle to progress, despite the fact that it was profitable to the North and to the industrialists. A very similar thing happened in Brazil. Brazil's economy in the 19th century relied heavily on slave labor for coffee and sugar plantations, with slaves comprising an abundant, alarming portion of the workforce. This dependence on slavery delayed the adoption of wage labor and mechanized production, as the planters, who were the landowning class and had a lot of economic and political control over the country, had little incentive to invest in machinery when slaves were cheaper. Brazil's industrial growth only accelerated after slavery's abolition, which happened all the way in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do so. But it's also been argued that slavery actually contributed to industrialization. And this kind of makes sense when you zoom out from the American North-South divide and start to look at the United States as one country. Wealth from the slave trade and those colonial plantations in America helped to pay for the Industrial Revolution in the North, and also for Britain's Industrial Revolution. Of course, that wealth was also used to pay for the Union Army and for the West Africa Squadron and anti-slave trade naval missions, but the imprint of the economic benefits of slavery were still sort of there. Slaveholding regions in Britain, like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, still held much of the country's wealth and thus financed infrastructure and banks, and importantly, innovations like Watt's steam engine. Cotton from the American South, which was also produced by slaves, supplied 70% of Britain's textile industry by the 1850s, creating what has been called a synergy between slavery and industrial growth. But at the same time, profits from the slave trade were less than 5% of Britain's income. And other states like Prussia, which later became the German Empire, which practiced serfdom, not chattel slavery, also industrialized rapidly. And even the Netherlands, this sort of merchant republic that had evolved into a constitutional monarchy, saw their own industrial revolution. Based on this examination, slavery seems to only have contributed to industrialization in the sense that it was the economic system that preceded industrial development in the British Empire and United States and others, giving them the capital to fund industrial development. And thus, slavery is not necessarily a direct contributor in a general sense, like a precursor to industrial development. And after all, America's abolition of the slave trade did not derail Britain's or its own industrialization, and in fact, it spurred on the Second Industrial Revolution, as the textile industry shifted from sourcing its cotton to sharecropping, and in Britain's case, from India. And of course, the Second Industrial Revolution was where the coal really hit the turbine, so to speak. We witnessed a rapid growth in steel, electricity, and railroads, and immigrant labor in the United States started to become important leading into the 20th century. Britain relied mostly on coal, but the United States diversified using water power, coal, and later oil, with a more laissez-faire economy encouraging entrepreneurial innovation. In Belgium, Wallonia had coal and iron industries that produced their own industrial movement from the 1820s, earning it the role of the second industrial power after Britain. But interestingly, the Belgians focused on heavy industry, and actually, the Belgian Industrial Revolution was supported by state funding, unlike Britain or America's private capital approach. In Asia, Japan's Meiji Restoration led to a rapid industrialization as the Japanese adopted Western technologies. The government directly invested in infrastructure, education, and state-led heavy industry, and exported tea and silk to have the money to import the materials and machines to achieve industrial growth on par with the Americans, the Germans, or the British, without the resources of a colonial empire like Britain's or a massive continent-spanning land empire like the United States. In China and other parts of East Asia, industrialization didn't really even happen until the 20th century, as the Qing barely even industrialized. And this industrialization would even really only be confined to the Asian tigers, like Hong Kong, Shanghai, and the non-Chinese city-state of Singapore, along with other countries like Taiwan and South Korea, which all capitalized on cheap labor and new markets that industrial shipping brought to the table. Germany industrialized after its unification in 1850, and it, like Japan, didn't have this huge colonial market. But once it unified, it did have enough coal and iron to start rapidly investing in infrastructure even without the large colonial empire. The Germans used large universal banks to fund heavy industry, unlike Britain's use of private investors, and they built strong technical universities that managed to propel the Germans to become a world leader in steel, chemicals, and engineering by the turn of the century, only 50 years after the creation of the German state. And the Germans in particular tapped into markets with the United States or Britain to import raw materials, or with South America, Chile, and Brazil, to import raw materials and then export finished goods to external markets, not colonial markets like the British had done. So all of this diversity in the way peoples and nations industrialized throughout history should lead us to question the underlying principle here. What even are the conditions for an industrial revolution, considering the revolutions were so varied across the world? What truly led to industrial development? It's impossible to narrow this sort of thing down, especially because context is incredibly important to the history of industrialization. Some countries like Japan had technology introduced to them, some built things from the ground up like Britain, some places didn't even fully industrialize ever, so nuance is always important, but for the sake of not overcomplicating things in this video, I'm going to try my best to sort of establish some pillars that can serve as prerequisites for industrialization. The most important axiom is something that we probably don't even really consider. There has to be a need to develop new technology. It's a bit of a silly thing to think about, really, but in a world today where we have such abundant resources and access to markets and capital, to be able to literally develop new technology daily, like large AI language models and new car engines and random apps and even innovations in mining or energy production or computing power or medicine, we forget that there must exist a demand for these innovations or inventions to even have the minds and capital to produce them. Today, there's so much demand in the international markets that really you can always find a niche. There will usually be demand for something anywhere you go. But before the information age, before the industrial revolutions, really, throughout most of human history, it's not as simple as we need steamships to travel up the river and then boom, they're invented. Resources were always really limited, and thus societies needed to focus their limited energy and their limited resources on the pressing problems. So everywhere else, whether that be in the realm of transportation or production of certain resources or moving water around, the mindset was, if something isn't broke, you don't fix it, because trying to fix it could waste valuable resources in a society where nothing was certain. Another thing to think about in that same vein is that widespread technological innovation, risk-taking, usually requires a societal or cultural appreciation for scientific inquiry as an end itself, or innovation toward practical application. Britain had that in particular, which it developed after the scientific revolution through institutions like the Royal Society for Improving Natural Knowledge. But prior to the scientific revolution, taking a risk to invent something was almost like a life or death situation. Innovation for its own sake was highly disincentivized because it would be a loose end that wouldn't always be guaranteed to be productive in society. Additionally, innovation needs funding. Invention alone is meaningless unless someone can invest in that invention or innovation to allow it to take hold in society. Another big kicker is access to energy sources. We saw coal to be the jump starter in Britain and the United States, but there are of course other sources of energy that enabled factories to scale beyond water power. The main purpose of these fuel sources was to heat water to generate steam, which filled a cylinder, wherein the steam was then condensed with cold water, creating a vacuum that pulled a piston down. This up and down motion was, as we said, first used to pump water out of mines, but it was low efficiency because each cycle wasted heat, reheating and cooling the same cylinder. James Watt added a separate condenser, so the main cylinder stayed hot while steam condensed elsewhere, and this saved fuel and made engines more efficient. But the key thing Watt did was also develop rotative motion, using a beam and flywheel to power spinning machines like textile mills instead of just pumps. Of course, this developed over time with inventors like Richard Trevithick, who used high-pressure steam that could directly push pistons both ways, no vacuum needed, and that brought about revolutions in transportation. But the key factor here was that everything required a good, efficient, very dense fuel source to heat the water. And beyond just fuel, other raw materials are needed for processing, whether they be agricultural materials like cotton or sugar, or things like basic metals and ores. Industrialization also needs large available workforces which have the capacity for population growth and urbanization, which usually themselves require a level of agricultural sophistication, like with Britain's agricultural revolution, that would free up this farm labor for the cities and for the factories. Innovation typically needs at least banking or some sort of way to invest, institutions to be able to invest capital. Britain's banks, their joint stock companies, and their global profits from trade provided the capital to build factories and railroads that themselves improved British logistics. And on a similar note, industrialization itself needs logistics and efficient, repeatable, and reliable transportation. Canals, roads, and later railways were vital to moving raw materials and finished goods between locations. And without logistics, the scaling of industry is nearly impossible. But beyond the physical and economic, you needed a culture that was capable of prioritizing innovation over tradition. Pre-Meiji Restoration Japan did not have this. It was an isolated, heavily traditional society. But Germany did. In fact, it's often the quintessential go-to example when you need a joke about something being efficient or well-engineered. German engineering, they say. Now, part of this cultural component is governmental. You need a society with the institutional frameworks, both legal and in the markets, to have investment in innovation. You also need a stable society and stable government. Industrialization typically didn't happen in countries where governments were not stable, governments which didn't have succession lines or ways of electing new representatives. And further, governments that protected private property and patents tended to also industrialize quicker or more smoothly than otherwise. Now, Rome, and I can't wait for the comments informing me that I didn't even talk about the Roman Empire until whatever timestamp this is, maybe 20 minutes in, but Rome is an unusual and interesting case study in this technological development. Of course, industrialization is not uniform, nor is it guaranteed, nor is it linear, but when we look at these general sort of precursors for industrial development, we notice that Rome doesn't actually check all the boxes. Rome has logistics. Rome super excelled in this realm, with some of the best roads, ports, aqueducts, and shipping networks in the pre-modern world. Rome also has access to a continent's supply of raw materials, iron, copper, lead, marble, agricultural surpluses when the harvests were good, and Rome probably had some coal, especially in Britannia, but we don't have a ton of evidence for its use as a standardized fuel for heating outside of Britain. And then the other thing Rome has sometimes is a stable government with a rule of law and systems for property rights which support economic growth. Rome does have some demand for innovations, but most of them fell into three categories. Survival, which basically means supporting their massive land empire through logistics, things like aqueducts and canals, those sorts of things. They really excelled at engineering. Things for the military, innovations in metallurgy and tactics and those sorts of things, and then innovation for the elites. And this is something we'll talk about more later, but stuff like leisure for the elite classes, for the senatorial classes. And these three categories are not really actually the kind of innovation that breeds transformative industrial technologies. And elsewhere, the Roman Empire struggles a bit more. As we mentioned, Rome never exploited coal or other high-density fuel on a large enough scale for it to be a naturally thought-up consistent fuel source should they have needed one. When the Romans heated things, they usually used wood because it was abundant, and other energy was usually dependent on human and animal labor, and then water power, which the Romans were incredibly innovative in, and occasionally wind power as well. But Rome does not have a cultural drive for practical innovation, and let me qualify that before you write an essay in the comments. Again, Roman engineering was pragmatic, and it focused on construction and innovation for military conquest. Very rarely was there innovation for the sake of experimental science, or the mechanization of processes that could otherwise be performed by human or animal labor. And another reason for that, beyond this reliance on human and animal labor and this sort of cultural factor, is that Rome didn't have institutions at a high level to promote such innovation for productivity. But I do want to also sort of zoom in on the labor aspect of this, because a big hurdle is Rome's heavy reliance on slave labor. Slavery, again, reduces the incentivized to mechanize, as we mentioned, because cheap human labor is far easier than investing in machines. That said, automation was actually a subject of popular discussion among the Romans, as they often sought ways to reduce workloads and cut demand for manpower with machines requiring far fewer workers. But little came of this discussion. There was no economic incentive and no cultural force to prompt anyone to act on this. Now, the Romans did recognize that slavery was not truly free, as slaves required maintenance, food, and sometimes care, and over time, Roman slaves did receive more protections under the law as the expansion of the empire slowed and the inflow of captured slaves dried up, and so the population of slaves began to shrink. But highly skilled slave jobs like doctors and teachers were too complex to automate, and low-skilled jobs on farms and in mills and in mines were too simple to justify heavy investment in machines. There's also not a large pool of available population to build a workforce out of for a wage-based society. Roman society needed laborers in agriculture to support the entire empire, which was dependent on the annona system, the highly complex grain distribution network that fed the empire from mostly Egypt, but also other provinces. Rome didn't have the sort of agricultural revolution that the British benefited from, and thus there wasn't a surplus of formerly agricultural laborers that could then be used in factories or in cities as this sort of excess labor. Rome did actually have banking and credit, but there weren't investment networks or stock companies to finance large-scale industry. And possibly the worst hurdle to overcome, Roman society was incredibly conservative in terms of innovation, because innovation, as we mentioned, mainly served the military, logistics, or elite luxury needs. Now, that's not to say that Rome was not innovative. The Roman Empire has its reputation for a reason. The technological achievements of the Roman Empire represent the pinnacle of ancient engineering and ingenuity. Hydropower was a big keystone of Roman technology. The Romans were masters at manipulating water. They typically used two types of water wheels: undershot, which were powered by the natural flow of rivers, and overshot, where water was channeled from above, often using aqueducts, and fell onto the wheels, spinning it, which could achieve up to 70% greater efficiency. These water wheels powered mills and also raised water for irrigation, and as evidence at Barbegal in Gaul, which is now France, they drove large-scale flour production, described as the greatest known concentration of mechanical power in the ancient world. The Barbegal mills used 16 overshot wheels, which could produce enough flour for 80,000 people daily. The Romans also used water power for sawmills, and we see this with archaeological finds in Hierapolis and Ephesus in Anatolia, which had water wheels that powered spinning blade sawmills, and we even can read about them in the works of Roman poet Decimus Magnus Ausonius, whose poem Mosella, written around 370 AD about the beauties of rivers, describes water-driven saws cutting marble. The poet Ausonius writes, "The Ruer, which has earned celebrity for marvel and the speedy kill, which are both the names of rivers, make haste to join you with their servant waves to taste of you. The rower's fish are splendorous, while it keeps turning fast and furious, the millstone as it grinds the corn draws across the glossy marble shrieking saws. On either side a constant din is heard, but of the little leisure not a word. And we should note that this is not a direct translation, as the translator who translated the poem from Latin to English chose to impose a rhyme scheme onto the poem by selecting certain words. The original Latin text does not consistently use rhyme in the way that modern English poetry often does. Anyway, back to water. The Dolaucothi gold mines in modern-day Wales, which were fed by at least 5 man-made channels or canals, used water for hydraulic mining, for also hushing, which is using water to erode away stone, and for fire setting and extinguishing to extract ore. And we learn this from Pliny's Naturalis Historia. The baths of Caracalla used 49 wood-fired furnaces to heat water, circulated through hypocaust systems, and supplied by aqueducts delivering 20,000 cubic meters of water daily. The complex required 10 tons of wood daily, fed into fires by slaves, which again shows us Rome's mastery of logistics and technology, but also its dependence on slave labor and the use of some of this incredibly complex technology to fund purely elite novelty ventures. We also see that the primary fuel source used in the mines and the baths and whatnot was wood, not coal. And that's not to downplay the sheer brilliance of this technology, but these energy constraints and the reliance on labor over the benefits of mechanization are a hint that reveal to us why Rome's brilliant engineering did not evolve into industrial machinery. Still, Rome did have the capacity to innovate under constrained circumstances. Rome used pozzolana mortar in their concrete, which is a mortar made with volcanic ash that allowed for durable watertight structures, like the Pantheon and the Hagia Sophia. Pozzolana mortar had a tensile strength of 3,000 kilopascals, compared to lime mortar's 200 kilopascals. And lime mortar is the stuff we use between bricks on houses. Roman concrete is similarly incredible, lasting over 200 times longer than its modern counterparts, and strengthening over time, the recipe to which was only discovered in the year 2023, requiring the collaboration of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, Harvard, the Archaeological Museum of Priverno in Italy, several other museums, and private Italian and Swiss researchers. Again, in the year 2023. I'm making this video in 2025. That's 2 years ago we found out the recipe to Roman concrete. As you can imagine, Rome had incredible advancements in other materials. It has been debated whether or not the Romans were able to produce steel. We have evidence of cast iron in northern Lombardy for the 5th and 6th centuries AD, which is a bit after Rome's time. However, we also have archaeological evidence from sites in England that indicate iron smelting operations in bloomeries, which are big metallurgical furnaces that produced low-carbon steel for tools and weapons. The Romans did produce the lorica segmentata, which was a segmented iron armor, but it required precision forging and had a high cost and maintenance need, so it never really overtook chainmail. The Romans were great at glass blowing, and their glass even made it to China and India along the Silk Road. They had window glass, hanging oil lamps, and dichroic glass like the Lycurgus cup, which used actual nanotechnology, where they made the glass with tiny proportions of literal nanoparticles of gold and silver dispersed in colloidal form throughout the glass material using a method we still don't even know. And yes, you can look that up, that is real, all to simply allow the cup to change color under light. And that's the big thing, again, that we've been reiterating here over and over again that you're probably tired of hearing by now. A lot of these incredible material advancements and technological advancements served elite entertainment or military needs or logistics, and they didn't serve efficiency or mass production for consumer markets. And I think actually the most egregious example of this is the Aeolipile. The Aeolipile was invented by Hero of Alexandria, making it technically a Hellenic Egyptian product rather than a Roman invention, but regardless, it was invented in the Roman Empire. And the Aeolipile was basically an ancient steam engine of sorts. It was a steam-driven rotating ball that produced about 1,500 RPM. But it was something of a gimmick. It was literally invented just to be a novelty item for the upper classes. And that's right, the Romans literally invented the steam engine as a trinket. And again, this is the kind of problem you run into with industrializing Roman society. It should be noted now that the Aeolipile was probably impractical even if it were to be used as a steam engine, because if it were to be used for industrial purposes, it would have very high labor costs for fueling and maintaining the heat, even worse so than those early British steam engines, and it likely lacked the torque for industrial use anyway. But we did see other elements of Roman technology that are reminiscent of the concepts behind how the steam engine was used in Britain and America for industrial development. The Hadrian sawmills, crank, connecting rod, and force pumps could very easily be elements of a steam engine. But of course, Rome lacked a scientific method or an economic incentive or even standardization to use these components from this invention in conjunction with these other components from this other invention in such a way that it produced a new invention that could be used for wide-scale industrialization. Really, the point that I'm trying to make in this entire introduction is that sophistication, which the Roman Empire has, it was technologically the most sophisticated empire in the ancient world. Sophistication does not inherently lead to industrialization. It's not an inherent next step. In fact, Roman technology was actually rooted more so in a craft-based system, where knowledge was passed from master to apprentice, and it was often kept secret and documented by very, very few outside of that craft network, like historians like Vitruvius, Pliny the Elder, or Frontius. And though Rome had no qualms borrowing or improving techniques from the Greeks, the Etruscans, the Celts, the Carthaginians, Persians, and anyone else who had technology they were interested in, it was usually military technology, or administrative, like roads, arches, aqueducts, or in the case of the Punic Wars, naval ships. To step back a bit, this should reveal to us that industrial development is weird. It's not inevitable. It's hard to predict. It's hard to get a grasp on without hindsight. Development is context dependent. And Rome was the most sophisticated society on Earth during its age, and in that way, it truly rivaled Britain in scale, at least during their respective ages, but not in purpose. Fuels, labor availability, reliance on slavery, or the capacity for society or capital investment separate Rome from the empires that did industrialize. You know what the most interesting part about this societal comparison is? Just the plain worldview of these two civilizations. Britain believed it was part of a line of progress marching forward into the future, but Rome believed it was part of a cycle, that natural events and civilizations rose, fell, and repeated. Ironic for the empire that arguably gave Europe its first continent-wide shove into civilization. But the point is, Rome's sophistication served its imperial goals. It didn't serve the economic dynamism that the British Empire was living in. Roman technology wasn't meant to foster industrialization because it simply wasn't in the zeitgeist of Roman society. It wasn't needed. Roman technology wasn't stagnant, and Rome certainly had the potential for technological development and maybe industrialization, but most compellingly, it simply lacked the societal will, as that will was directed toward maintaining the foremost empire in the ancient world. But what if all of that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Roman Empire did industrialize? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. We're currently trying to reach our goal of 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and every little bit helps the channel out. If you want to help support our content, you can watch through our extensive catalog of videos, or consider supporting your legion, like our current channel members, Eaglefall, Derek Arno, Wolfgang von Siefertberg, Roanoke, Star Galaxy, Stratocrat, Daniel Angelis, Alfonso Maurice, PJ the Homeless Mage, Chance Bowman, Justin Ambrew, Dark X, Scott Williams, Kennedy the V, Rex Ferris, History with Troy, C. Zachary Myers, Grim Reaper KL, and Matthew Jelly. Thank you, and enjoy the video. The first question to ask is what would have needed to change for the Roman Empire to achieve industrialization with the same sort of civilization-changing force of 18th century Britain? Rome needs to be fundamentally altered at a societal and economic level. Culturally, Rome would need a scientific revolution to establish a systemic approach to knowledge creation and dissemination, akin to Europe's scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries. Rome lacked a formalized scientific method. Figures like Archimedes demonstrated brilliance in the scientific realm, but their work was again often isolated and not institutionalized, with many passing down their work in secret, disallowing collaboration, which is a key component of innovation. Now, we could suppose, for the sake of the scenario, that Archimedes had survived the siege of Syracuse in 212 BC and established a school of thought, perhaps in Alexandria, where the library and museum already fostered a sort of intellectual, philosophical exchange. This could have seeded a tradition of empirical inquiry and encouraged experimentation and, crucially, documentation of knowledge instead of the sort of craft-based secrecy. Such a school, should it have been carried over and disseminated through Roman society, might have standardized mathematical and mechanical principles, which makes it so much easier to build off of other inventions and concepts. Newton came before Einstein for a reason. An Archimedean school could have expanded upon innovations like the Ancythera mechanism, a 2nd century BC astronomical device considered the world's first analog computer, a gear mechanism that was a model of the solar system. However, this scientific shift would also require cultural support for intellectual labor over physical labor and Rome's warrior elite ethos. To this end, we maybe see some sort of philosophical movement, perhaps an offshoot of Stoicism, that could reframe progress as a moral good, which would then elevate the merchant classes and inventors from their low social status. The Roman elites thought very negatively of the merchant class, but a sort of progressive Stoicism might argue that improving human welfare through technology and trade would align with the rational order, a cultural counterweight then to the aristocracy's disdain for commerce. But another component is that, to disseminate this knowledge, Rome would need the printing press, a technology which is absent in antiquity but still feasible with Rome's metallurgy and woodworking skills. Ink, which in Roman times was made from soot and resin, was already readily available, and wooden presses for the printing press could perhaps be adapted from Roman wine presses. And the empire already produced papyrus and parchment, and the elites were generally very literate. These factors, if we combine them with a societal shift toward valuing the preservation and dissemination of knowledge and technology and science, could support a printing industry, especially if it gets picked up and driven by a merchant class that is incentivized by profit. This would also, however, require a cultural shift valuing widespread literacy, even among the non-aristocrats. Maybe we could say this is perhaps spurred on by a Renaissance like it was in Europe in our history. However, Rome here lacks a clear historical model for such a Renaissance. After all, in our history, the model for the Renaissance was Rome. The closest parallel might be the Second Sophistic movement in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, which revived Greek intellectualism, but it focused on rhetoric, not science or literacy or any other sort of thing. Maybe, and this is a bit out there, but maybe there's something like a rediscovery of Hellenistic texts preserved in Alexandria, coupled with patronage from emperors like Hadrian, who was known for his cultural investment, and so you get a sort of movement interested in literacy for the sake of acquiring this hidden knowledge. But even then, this isn't likely to be a movement that spreads across all classes across the entire empire, so it's a difficult problem to tackle, the problem of literacy. Now again, economically, Rome's reliance on slave labor is one of the biggest obstacles. Slavery suppressed the incentives for mechanization, as cheap labor was abundant, so nothing was really needed, nor worth it to replace that labor. So transitioning Rome to a wage-based economy that is able to foster this industrial development would require reducing slavery's dominance in the empire. This could be spurred on by a slave revolt like Spartacus's in 73 BC, but scaled up a ton to disrupt the empire's labor system. So maybe if we say Spartacus had secured a region like Sicily and established a free labor economy, it might have, 1, demonstrated the viability of this free labor wage-based work, but 2, disincentivized the use of slavery because of the risk of organized revolt like Spartacus' rebellion. However, this could just as easily destabilize the empire or lead to harsher conditions for the slaves to prevent revolt. There is absolutely no guarantee, which is why this problem, just like the literacy and cultural problems, are so difficult. Alternatively, maybe we see some sort of a technological agricultural revolution, similar to Britain's 18th century innovations in agricultural technology, that could free up labor. But this is unlikely in the first place for the same reasons that an industrial revolution is unlikely in the first place. Still, suppose a Roman inventor developed a seed drill or a mechanized plow that is able to boost agricultural yields. If the state invests in this to better feed the armies or to improve the annona system, this could, and that's a big could, free up some labor for urbanization. Then, if this wage labor economy takes hold in Rome, which is already incredibly unlikely, we still need a means to get those constant improvements and incentivize mechanization. We could see like a plague, maybe the Antonine plague, which killed up to 10% of the empire's population. That could create labor scarcity, which would drive up wages and incentivize mechanization to offset the population losses. And then we'd also need to see the Romans somehow recognize that coal is a better fuel source and start building the infrastructure for large-scale coal mining and transitioning from wood to coal. And all these changes would also require institutional reforms to empower a merchant-driven political class that can advocate for good policy here. Maybe we say a merchant-friendly emperor like a Severan with ties to trade-heavy provinces like Syria could be a candidate here to reform properly these laws to protect investors and even a patent system, assuming the printing press is widespread already. This could then encourage entrepreneurial risk, especially since Roman logistics are already the best of the best, and Rome's centralized tax system can provide state funding for bigger projects if needed. And then out of the collegia, the trade guilds, we could see stock companies that can pool capital for factories and infrastructure. But needless to say, it's difficult, very, very difficult, if not impossible, for all of this to happen together. We probably don't even have all the factors or changes that Rome would even need, to be completely honest. And we've gotten as far as the Severans, guys. This is basically the crisis of the 3rd century. The fall of Western Rome happened in the 5th century AD. That gives us 200 years for Rome's Industrial Revolution to affect things. It's not a lot of time for such an institutional shift to take hold, and that's a lot of instability that really wouldn't benefit anything here. So instead, let's use a bit of alternate history magic and suppose that somehow, even though it's unrealistic, for the sake of the scenario, Rome manages to foster the perfect conditions for an industrial revolution during the Pax Romana, during the Good Emperor's period, so that we have a decent period of stability to keep things simple. Perhaps we'll say under Hadrian in about 120 AD or so. And I know it's unrealistic, and I know there's a lot of things that have to happen for this to even be possible, but one thing that I'd like to say that I'm actually making up right now, but I'd like to say, is that the premise of a hypothetical does not necessarily need to be realistic in order for it to be educational, in order for it to be useful or interesting. And the first interesting results of this premise come as a result of the prerequisites that enable a Roman industrial revolution. The valuation of intellectual labor means that Rome now values its merchant class, which has new abilities to climb the social ladder and gain influence through the collegia and pool capital for new ventures, whether they be mercantile or, soon enough, industrial. Literacy would now have spread beyond the elites, with printed texts making education accessible to urban artisans and free men, creating a proto-middle class. This middle class, educated in technical schools, would be able to drive innovation in metallurgy and mechanics and disseminate the information gathered in these fields to other corners of the empire, with new technology now being invented and shared rather than kept locally. The Roman government would of course be forced to adapt to these changes. The Senate would be reformed to include representatives from trade-heavy provinces like Syria and Egypt. Property laws would be revised to protect patents. The state would, of course, for the sake of the scenario, despite not necessarily being realistic, fund infrastructure ventures like coal mines and canals in Britannia and Gaul. With the right leadership, an industrial revolution would take hold. Again, it's not necessarily realistic, but it does give us enough time for this industrialized Rome to fester and get used to its own new situation. The process would begin in urban centers like Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. We'll assume for the sake of our scenario that Roman craftsmen would have developed a steam engine based on the Aeolipile in order to pump water along the aqueducts and improve the water distribution networks, or maybe for some other reason, like pumping water out of mines. How creative. But soon these devices would be fitted and adapted for textile mills and iron forges. We'd see the first inklings of what would later become large-scale factories begin to sort of emerge along the river Tiber and the Nile, employing free artisans and former slaves as wage-earning workers. These skilled workers who, thanks to printed manuals, would be able to learn and gain technical expertise and social mobility, would begin to build communities of their own, moving into these urban centers along the rivers and increasing their population. And this would also increase the demand for food, spurring on further innovation from these urban centers and their collegias and literate, technically skilled members of the emerging middle class, who would develop new ways to increase agricultural efficiency, lessening the demand for animal and human labor even more. Of course, the more this industrial framework takes hold, the easier it will be to squash out the remaining pockets of slavery in the empire, and the easier it will be to transition away from the remnants of that labor-based system and into this new industrial economy. Now, militarily, Hadrian's defensive policy would benefit from this new technology to aid in the extraction and transportation of the materials needed for the rapid construction of his fortifications. We could see the invention of rudimentary steam-powered cranes, adapted from Greek designs for existing counterweight-based cranes used to lift heavy stones, speeding up wall repairs and erecting new fortresses along the Rhine and the Danube. Rome's enemies, like the Picts and the German tribes, would of course lack the infrastructure to mimic these advancements, but they may end up benefiting indirectly from looted Roman tools and other found technology. Under another one of the good emperors, Antonius Pius, the empire would enjoy stability, allowing this industrial growth to spread. Antonius Pius would expand canal networks in Gaul and Egypt, using now steam-powered dredgers to deepen the canals for heavier trade barges. And these barges would carry coal, iron, and textiles that would be able to connect Britannia's mines to rivers that would lead to the Mediterranean ports, aiding in internal trade, and connecting Britannia solidly to the Mediterranean world. The proto-middle class would grow, and in the fields, plows powered by oxen but enhanced with iron blades would continue to feed more quicker, as the agricultural surplus would be stored in new granaries and silos to be used in case of famines, which was one of the greatest concerns in our historical Rome, where harvest failures often created periods of intense political unrest. Soon, innovations like standardized gears and pistons would enable a sort of modular machinery that would spread like wildfire across the empire. Rome would begin the development of early steamships, clunky but somewhat effective, using paddle wheels and coal-fired boilers to navigate the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. And soon, thicker hulls would deter attacks from pirates and the weak Nabateans, who often attacked ships from their encampments in southern Arabia. Trade with India would become more regular, importing iron-steel cloth, various spices, frankincense, wine grains, and exporting textiles, glasses, and Roman tools. Soon we may even see permanent Roman quarters in the ancient Tamil country, expanding from the existing Greek and Roman trade settlements along the seafaring Tamil states of the Pandyan, Chola, and Chera dynasties. This would all inadvertently strengthen Rome's grip on the Silk Road, as these merchants would be able to outcompete Parthian and Scythian middlemen. We would see more private naval ventures funded by the merchant classes to explore beyond, reaching Sri Lanka and establishing trade posts, perhaps facilitating irregular Roman trade as far as the Ganges River. All of this may seem to be quite fast, quite unusually rapid, but these developments are all actually coming at a slower pace than the Industrial Revolution in our own history. The first Industrial Revolution happened at about 1760. Only 40 some odd years later, in the early 1800s, steamships were commonplace. The technological acceleration was simply unimaginably fast. And here I've even slowed it down for the sake of not being too wildly unrealistic in this already somewhat unrealistic premise. And of course, with this rapid change in life and technology comes social upheaval. Within the empire, we could see Romanization accelerate as people begin to congregate in urban areas, which are really the centers of the Roman lifestyle. The authority of the remnants of the tribal systems in Gaul and Britannia and Hispania would wane, especially as the rural populations moved to the cities, leaving this room open for military estates. Britannia in particular would see something that was absent in art history that made it such an alien region to the Romans: integration into the Mediterranean economic world, something that would now be easily facilitated with this industrial Rome, exploiting its iron, coal, tin, and lead resources. But this Romanization would not come without its challenges, especially among this urban working class, literate, well-fed, and now politically aware. It's likely that in the coming years, these populations would begin to demand political representation, leading Antonius or Marcus Aurelius after him to expand municipal councils in provincial cities, which would strengthen local governments and allow them to respond quicker to the needs of their populations. But the trade-off is, of course, that this would sow the seeds of regional autonomy, a potential future risk that we saw under the Tetrarchy in our own history. Under Marcus Aurelius specifically, industrialization would see some challenges from the Antonine Plague, given these now urbanized populations in likely unsanitary conditions, more crowded and more prone to disease from ventures abroad to the far corners of the world. The plague would kill more than it had in our own history, and in our time it had already killed a quarter to a third of the population of the empire. Now, still the population would likely be higher than in our own history with the food security we saw under the last two emperors and the better general baseline quality of life, but needless to say, the plague would still be disastrous, creating labor shortages which would have the effect of accelerating mechanization and decreasing the burden on the agricultural sectors, but would likely also create a fear of these urban environments and of disease. Perhaps certain segments of the intellectual classes would begin to discuss disease and plague, spurring on a medical revolution in Rome, but that much is more speculation than anything. I think money would flow from the emperor directed toward investment and research, which, among other things, may even produce the first locomotives, running on wooden rails in the mines used to transport coal and iron more efficiently, though they'd be too primitive for widespread use. Still, they could find use in the military, where Marcus faced the Marcomannic Wars against the Marcomanni tribes north of the Danube. The military could make use of steam-powered siege engines, bastillae with steam-driven winches to allow for faster assaults on Germanic forts. Roman legions would be now equipped with mass-produced iron swords and would easily outmatch the barbarian tribes, though some of the Germans would inevitably take home Roman swords to use on their own or even try to reverse engineer these sorts of technologies, likely to little success. But Marcus's death in 180 AD would bring the emperor Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, breaking from the tradition of appointing a skilled heir to rule. Commodus, unlike his father, was disinterested in government, focusing on gladiatorial spectacles, diverting funds to lavish games, and neglecting infrastructure, and this eventually caused a political crisis. This new middle class would likely agitate him for reform, but none would come until Commodus's assassination, ordered by the Praetorian Guard in 192 AD, which would trigger the Year of the Five Emperors, a chaotic power struggle that would end with the victory of the Severan candidate, Septimius Severus, who, in addition to his strategic strengths and political opportunism, would also have ties to trade-heavy Syria and Carthage, which would probably content the merchant class. Severus, as in our own history, would restore stability. Under the 43-year-long Severan Dynasty, industrialization would likely peak. Rail networks would be built, with iron rails replacing wooden ones connecting Rome to Capua and Alexandria to Memphis. These railways would transport grain and textiles to the ports to be loaded onto steamships, which were already constantly being innovated and iterated upon. Caracalla, Severus's son and the next emperor in the Severan dynasty, would extend citizenship to all free men, as in our own history, but in this timeline it would also be partly motivated by a need to integrate the proto-middle class into imperial governance, granting them voting rights and pacifying them. The merchants would establish colonies in Africa, perhaps as far as the Gold Coast, accessing gold and ivory, but these outposts would also strain imperial resources as distant, difficult-to-supply garrisons would be needed to protect them. Some may end up abandoned during periods of unrest, sunk costs, or unprofitable ventures. Militarily, the Severans could use some of this technology, things like new catapults perhaps somehow using steam power, and things like traveling forges in the campaigns against Parthia, even capturing Ctesiphon during Severus's reign in 198 AD. But the Parthians would counter and attempt to adapt as the Sassanids began to rise. And of course, as we approach the mid-3rd century, we must consider the crisis of the 3rd century that ended the Severans. In our history, it was triggered by political instability from a series of assassinations of emperors, along with economic decline, inflation, a debased currency, barbarian invasions, the rising Sassanid Persia, and the real nail in the coffin was food insecurity and the interruption of the Annona grain distribution system. Industrialization would mitigate some of these factors, but also introduce its own new risks. This Rome already has a more even wealth distribution and some economic and political resilience from the slightly more decentralized meritocratic systems of this alternate timeline. Barbarian invasions are also less devastating, which is good for our purposes. Inflation and currency valuation, though, could really go either way, as the mines are probably more efficient, but this could reduce the value of these metals used for currency like we saw in the Spanish Empire. Likewise, however, with a much more institutionalized and intact internal trade network and a wealthy merchant class, the economy would probably overall be less command-oriented, which was a major reason these periods of instability were so earth-shaking. To put a pin in it, the crisis is probably going to be significantly softened in this alternate timeline, and I expect Rome to pull through quite quickly, perhaps not even having to deal with powerful breakaway states. However, following Severus Alexander's death, the empire will still face immediate instability as Maximinus Thrax, a military strongman, seizes power. Maximinus's heavy taxation and militarism alienated the Senate and populace in our own history, and here he would only do so more, lacking the merchant ties of the Severans, likely unable to maintain loyalty in industrial hubs like Alexandria and Antioch, and with this merchant and middle class demanding stability to protect their investments. In good time, most of the political forces of the empire would likely be aligned against him. The subsequent power struggle would probably see Gordian III, backed by the Senate and likely now also the merchants, emerge as emperor slightly older than he had in our own history, perhaps in his late teens now. Gordian would be young but well-advised, ruling over an empire seeking to consolidate after some brief turmoil. And this was historically the case during his rule, which, upon its end, brought about the real chaos of the crisis. Gordian's reign was like the eye in the storm in the middle of the crisis of the 3rd century. But in this timeline, I think things might be a little calmer after his tenure. Investment would expand the rail network, and engineers in Egypt would use pumps to reclaim marshland. But soon Gordian would face the Sassanid Empire, which, under Shapur I, would have begun to attempt to match Roman armor and weapons. Sassanid cavalry would now be equipped with iron-plated armor, fighting Roman volleys at the Battle of Mysicae. But Rome still has such a great degree of technological superiority over the Sassanids that this would probably actually come as a devastating loss for the Persians when, in our history, these campaigns were generally strategic successes for them. However, as the fighting continues, Shapur could come to capture Roman engineers, enabling Persia to experiment in narrowing the technological gap on their own. Now, it's been said that Gordian III died around this time at age 19, likely in the aforementioned Battle of Mysicae, as the Sassanids historically claimed, or by assassination, with the historian Hadrian of Antioch suggesting his troops, or the Praetorian Guard, possibly under the influence of Philip the Arab, who historically reigned after Gordian, were responsible. Now, given his youth and reliance on advisors, assassination is still a real risk here. However, with the industrial economy's stability, a lack of boiling resentment from the eastern provinces, and really Rome had an upper hand against the Sassanids, I think it's safer to assume that Gordian III would actually avoid assassination due to his advisor's competence and the vested interest in stability among the wealthy elites. His reign could thus extend into his 30s, perhaps to 260 AD, allowing him to consolidate power, fight the Sassanids, and also defend against the Goths, who had begun to raid from the north. If we assume he doesn't have a child, which I guess is a bit of a dumb assumption, but still, he would likely appoint a successor to ensure continuity, possibly a capable general, or a senator with merchant ties, such as a descendant of Timotheus, who was his historical mentor, or some other fictional figure, maybe a senator from a mercantile province, but likely an Eastern emperor. I think we'll see a lot more Syrian emperors in this timeline, though we probably won't ever see an Egyptian emperor. Since it's hard from now on to gauge the line of succession, however, we'll have to zoom out a bit and look at the broader strokes of what's going to happen outside of the imperial dynasties. Again, Gordian himself had no children, but his appointed heir could perhaps establish a dynasty, with political stability returning, no second wave of the 3rd century crisis, and I imagine the empire's administrative system undergoing some adaptive reforms during this period of consolidation. Historically, Rome governed through a mix of senatorial and imperial provinces, with governors, either proconsuls or legates, managing the local elites who retained their autonomy in exchange for loyalty. This system was of course efficient for a pre-industrial empire, but now as the urban centers, especially in the east, grow into industrial hubs with their own councils, we will have to see further adaptation. The Senate, as we mentioned, has already been reformed to include provincial representatives, but the emperor still retains ultimate imperium. But there are other efficiencies that can mitigate any stress on this large land empire. The printing press will, of course, allow for the dissemination of standardized laws beyond just technical manuals, allowing for a kind of bureaucratic coherence across the provinces, something that already existed in the Rome of our world but would only be strengthened here, keeping the peace and allegiance to the emperor. Still, I think Rome could go a bit further and bring some of these regions into the senatorial province system for the larger, now more populated, Romanized, and industrialized provinces like Lugdunensis, Aquitania, Syria Coele, maybe even Syrophoenicia, Tarraconensis, maybe Egypt, though this might be a bit of a stretch, and probably Thrace. Here, these new senatorial provinces could be governed by the Senate, and assuming very likely that the senators have by this point come around to culturally accept and dine with the wealthy merchant class and profit from their successes, the mercantile provinces in particular will be more politically stable and see themselves as having an elevated position which they'd rightfully deserve within the empire. These new senatorial provinces could pass their own laws and decrees, which would adapt to their regional needs, whether they be an industrial province or a mercantile province or what have you. However, this still somewhat stretches Rome's administrative capacity, as the senatorial governors still have to manage complex industrial economies alongside their traditional duties. Again, we still have communication improvements, which can even be innovated further, like steam-powered couriers or early telegraph-like systems using signal towers or coded flags, but the senators governing these provinces will undoubtedly have to rely on a very complicated bureaucratic network to keep things running smoothly, which can be challenging at times, though Rome was certainly no stranger to complex political systems. I'd say the empire's ruling capacity is sufficient for now, but overextension could strain it, and expansion is likely to come in the coming years. Historically, Rome controlled the Black Sea's western and southern coasts through the provinces like Moesia and Bithynia, with client kingdoms like the Bosphorus securing the northern shore. In this timeline, a stabler Rome could easily push back the Goths and come to dominate the Black Sea, like Mithridates of Pontus had once dreamed of, with Roman steamships patrolling from Sinope to Trapezius and neutralizing piracy. Exploration up the Dnieper River is also feasible, as Roman engineers could use steam dredgers to navigate and fortify river routes up it. The Dnieper River flows through modern-day Ukraine and was home to the Scythian and Sarmatian tribes, who were semi-nomadic pastoralists with little to no urban infrastructure. There aren't major rapids, however it does freeze over in the winter months, meaning lasting settlement here could be hindered without well-established land supply routes. If the rail infrastructure is adequate and the Goths can be kept from destroying this infrastructure, Roman settlement of modern-day Ukraine actually becomes a little bit viable, if perhaps ambitious. The Romans never had a name for this region, though we could just call it Scythia Magna. And so establishing outposts along the Dnieper, such as the rapids near modern-day Dnipro, Ukraine, would secure grain but also the lucrative fur trade. The fertile Ukrainian steppe, which harbors the black Chernozem soil, the most fertile soil in the world, could also be exploited if properly settled to feed the empire. If Scythia Magna was properly turned into a second breadbasket supplementing Egypt, Rome would nearly have unparalleled access to food in the ancient world. However, it would still have to deal with Sarmatian resistance that would be pretty difficult to overcome in this relatively flat terrain, which would require fortified colonies starting from the Dnieper's mouth and expanding northward, building walls rapidly using steam technology. Exploration east from here into the Caucasus is less likely beyond the coasts due to the rugged terrain, even with Rome's better transportation technology and hostile tribes like the Alans, but trade posts in modern-day Georgia could tap into the northerly silk and spice routes of the Silk Road if it became difficult to trade with the Sassanids in the way. This would give Rome routes to the east through both the Indian Ocean and the Caspian Sea. With regard to Dacia, which would inevitably be integrated into the Roman client system more intimately, perhaps even seeing annexation, Dacia's gold mines were immensely profitable, and if Rome can improve its logistics across the Carpathians, this would be a perfect region to exploit with better mining technology. Assuming, of course, that with this softer 3rd century crisis, Dacia is not abandoned by the Romans, Rome can economically tie Dacia to itself with technology and with imperial oversight, enabling it to better control the region, especially as more fortified passes can be developed to bring it closer into the Mediterranean economic world. The Danube is also an option here, as ships were able to pass the Iron Gates by being towed by locomotives in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it's not out of the question that a similar setup could be managed here, allowing Rome to connect Dacia to the upper Danube and exponentially increasing its control over the region. However, this would also have to come with stations or small ports to repair these ships along the way, and treaties with the locals and the migrating Goths, which would already be problematic for the Romans. Piracy, Gothic uprisings, and shipwrecks would be a persistent setback. But altogether, Rome is actually quite technologically prepared for expansion and consolidation over these eastern territories. Now, we could also see this period of stability and expansion direct some resources northward to pushing the Germans back. Historically, Augustus's attempt to conquer Germania Magna failed after the Teutoburg Forest disaster in 9 AD. In this timeline, Rome has an obvious technological and logistical advantage, assuming, of course, they can get rail lines set up or steamships up the Danube and maybe the Rhine. Under Gordian or one of his successors, Rome could launch a campaign around the mid-3rd century AD, which would now target the Elbe as a new natural frontier. This is, of course, ambitious, but possibly achievable, assuming a few things. First, Rome has to decisively control the modern-day Benelux region, around the Netherlands and Belgium, where the mouth of the Rhine is. This means either expelling, killing, or integrating the Frisi, Belgae, and Batavi, and keeping the Franks out of the region. Assuming this succeeds, they now have a means to construct steamships that can move up and down the Rhine, which is beneficial considering the major tributaries of the Rhine, such as the Moselle, tended to flow into Gaul, making it easy for Rome to control river travel and use the Rhine as a means to access their own provinces. The other assumption is that Rome has the population, the will, and the means to actually settle and conquer Germania Magna. They would by now have the literacy rate and records to probably be able to teach counter-guerrilla tactics and learn from historical encounters with the Germanic tribes, but it would be a campaign to essentially overwhelm the larger tribes like the Cherkessi, Alemanni, and Franks and to take out the Saxons before they prove a threat. Again, their success depends on how well they can populate the region with Romans and assimilate the remaining Germanic holdover populations, but it would be an investment of heavy garrisons that would take decades to assert control over and risk overextension. It would give the Romans a shorter border region to have to control than the Rhine-Danube border for most of imperial history, but it's also less strategically advantageous without the protection of the valleys and forests, and it leaves Rome open to attacks from the European plain, which were almost never absent. Overextension does become a worry, especially with threats from the east, though at the same time Rome does now command the infrastructure to connect its provinces more efficiently and build more efficient walls and anti-siege fortifications. What's better, the Sassanids do lack the infrastructure for a full-scale industrial revolution, as their economy relied on agrarian feudalism and tribute from the satrapies or provinces, not a merchant-driven market like this new Rome harbors. Their technological base was advanced in metallurgy and irrigation, which could perhaps allow them to adopt and reverse engineer certain Roman tools, armor, and technology, but they, again, would basically lack the same sorts of things the Romans lacked, this sort of scientific inquiry, mass literacy, etc., to foster a Persian industrial revolution. So, essentially, Rome will maintain a technological superiority over basically all of its neighbors for a really long time, until these sorts of ideas and concepts begin to drift out of the Roman Empire like they had drifted out of the British Empire in our own history. So the Sassanids, even if they could capture Roman technology, weapons, and maybe even Roman engineers, would still be unable to mass reproduce the technology and the success of Rome beyond which they immediately had simply captured. Still, with regard to the military, Persia would see the imbalance with Rome, and the Sassanids would correct and react, as we saw historically with their imitation of Roman siege tactics. But there, again, is a real lack of infrastructure here to support mass industrialization or even mass production of the military technology they would need to defeat Rome, let alone the population they would require to outcompete this much larger Roman population. Rome could thus feasibly retain control of Mesopotamia, which is particularly beneficial as the Tigris-Euphrates corridor is the richest part of the Near East. And with the logistical capacity and a client kingdom buffer strategy, Roman control here would really only be a matter of infrastructure and supply lines. However, for Rome to go any further east and try to hold Persia's heartland in modern Iran is basically unfeasible, not just because of the resistance from the Zoroastrian Persians, but also because Roman technology and logistics wouldn't really even be able to stretch into these rugged, mountainous, arid regions without huge infrastructure projects that would inevitably be expensive, long, suffer constant ambushes, and not really be worth the price. Instead, Rome would probably install a Mesopotamian client kingdom just in Ctesiphon, securing trade routes to India and China, and leave the Persians to regroup further east. Mesopotamia would again be a bit of a challenge, but with Roman transportation technology, it is possible to hold on to and maintain as a buffer against any attacks from the east, especially as Roman trade infiltrates the region and establishes an economic incentive for its inhabitants to side with Rome instead of Persia. All of this expansion also makes you wonder about exploration. Private merchant ventures along the Silk Road could feasibly reach China's western borders through Central Asia, establishing non-imperial trade posts in Sogdiana in modern-day Uzbekistan, but posts that would probably over time be opened and shut and replaced periodically given the private nature of their funding and the variable lack of garrisons to defend them. If the Romans reach Seres Occidentalis, or Western China, and assuming some of them make it back to the empire with written recountings of their experiences, Rome could expand their vague knowledge of China. This could spark an interest among the mercantile elite or the Roman government in trying to reach China, both by land and by sea. China was in the middle of the Three Kingdoms period at this time, which was one of the most turbulent and militarized eras in Chinese history. The Han Dynasty had been divided during this period into three rival states, the Hui, the Shu, and the Wu. Now, by this point in history, the Three Kingdoms period had kind of settled from the early, warring, dynamic phase of constant campaigns into a more stagnant, defensive, and politically... Now, Cao Hui controlled the north, and also the lands furthest west along the Silk Road, and it would thus be the Wei state that any Roman merchant who managed to make it that far would have encountered. But if the Romans tried to find a sea route, things would be even more interesting. We could broadly assume that Rome would have control of the Red Sea by now and have experienced sailors familiar with the Indian Ocean and even the Bay of Bengal, but they would not necessarily be familiar with the Malacca Straits. Storms, piracy, and supply issues would make this journey even more perilous, but those overland routes, even if they're safer and better charted, would be subject to raids and poor weather conditions until well-maintained outposts in Bactria and Gandhara could be erected, facilitating trade in silk, porcelain, Roman glass, and new industrial products like textiles and weaponry. The incentive for direct contact between Rome and China does exist, as merchants seek luxury goods, but again, direct imperial investment is unlikely. The most we might get are Roman quarters in the far western Chinese city of Duanhang, though it's unlikely we'll see much direct Roman contact with China, let alone something like even a conquest of the weak Three Kingdoms China. Venturing west is also unfortunately unlikely. Historically, the age of exploration and those voyages across the Atlantic and around Africa were driven by two factors. Venice developing a trade monopoly that newly established Spanish and Portuguese kingdoms wanted to usurp, and Muslim control over the eastern trade routes, cutting off the West from direct contact with China and India. Since these Christian kingdoms didn't want to go through the Ottoman middlemen, this required huge ship ventures around southern Africa. Neither of these factors, a different empire having a monopoly or some sort of barrier between the East and West, are really present here. Sure, the Sassanids are there, but they're not really a barrier because they relied on the Silk Road for their own wealth. Furthermore, Rome's steamships, while they're advanced, are not yet probably capable of transatlantic voyages. They lack the hull strength and the navigation tools developed in the 15th century. Though Norse expeditions did reach North America by 1000 AD, their longships were better suited for coastal navigation. But it's not out of the question. It's just really not in the question either. Private ventures by wealthy merchants might explore the Atlantic, inspired by tales of islands beyond Britannia such as Thule, but without an economic necessity, these would be small-scale and not really necessarily profitable. Discovering the Americas is thus thinly, very barely possible, but even then it would be a novel oddity, with no immediate incentive for colonization of the New World. Even if we imagine a merchant fleet reaching the Americas, they would only encounter the primitive Caribbean, and wouldn't encounter the large empires of Mesoamerica. There would be little to trade, harsh climates, and hostile natives, and thus it's likely the venture would be abandoned as unprofitable, though maps and artifacts would remain from it, and with a literate, curious Roman society, who knows, eventually these tales could inspire future expeditions. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, you should rightly be wondering about a second Industrial Revolution like the one we saw in our own history, which brought us electricity, oil, and all sorts of other inventions. But I'm not sure Rome is exactly ready for this quite yet. Electricity requires an understanding of electromagnetism, which emerged in the 19th century through English chemist and physicist Michael Faraday's experiments. Rome has the capacity to theorize about the existence of static electricity from amber, because the ancient Greeks, particularly Thales of Miletus, observed and described the phenomena that we call static electricity, noting that amber, when rubbed with fur, could attract light objects. They thus called amber electron, which is the origin of the word electricity. Still, this experiment doesn't really allow for the discovery of electromagnetism, nor does it really have any practical applications like generators that needed centuries of research. The Bessemer process is closer to Rome's speed, however. The Bessemer process is the process of converting iron to steel, and Roman metallurgy is certainly advanced, and there is also a military and economic incentive to develop stronger materials. Thus, I'd actually say that it's completely within reason that Rome will develop the blast furnace and begin producing things like steel for railways and ships. However, one of the most important innovations of the Second Industrial Revolution besides electricity is the internal combustion engine, which itself relies on oil refining, which is unfortunately very unlikely to develop in Rome, as oil was used very minimally, typically only for lamps in Mesopotamia. Coal would remain dominant, giving Rome something of a steampunk aesthetic to us in the modern age, with steam trains and ships defining technological innovation for the next few hundred years. I think that Rome's future will hinge on its ability to balance expansion, government, and new external threats. Rail and steamship networks would enable rapid troop deployment and internal trade, but governing this vast territory would strain even this reformed and logistically well-faring bureaucracy. Communication alone can't root out corruption, and soon it's likely that regional governors in some of these provinces like Syria and Britannia would begin asserting de facto independence, issuing their own coinage and negotiating trade deals with client kingdoms. This creeping fragmentation is not a collapse, but a slow erosion of the central authority no longer suited to this almost global system built by Rome, as local elites, their merchant classes, and even likely the soldiery would begin to prioritize regional profits in their homeland over imperial unity. To counter this, we could briefly see something of a Politeia Nova, a new politic, as time goes on, the formalizing of a council of provincial representatives to advise the emperor, akin to an early house of lords of sorts, or like what Louis XIV did to consolidate his reign in France, but soon pieces of the empire would begin to go their own way, with the West favoring agricultural exports and the East focusing on Silk Road trade. This industrial Mediterranean system would be better suited to independent countries, not a single, broad, hulking empire. The eastern hordes, particularly the Huns, would pose a significant challenge in the coming centuries, as they did historically. In this timeline, Rome's industrial defenses, their fortified walls, their catapults, their rail-supplied legions could easily repel the initial Hun raids along the Dnieper and the Elbe. However, over time, under a leader like the historical man who inspired the myth of Attila the Huns could form a confederation with the Goths and the Alans, launching a coordinated assault on Scythia Magna and the Elbe outposts. Rome would be forced to integrate certain border tribes as federati, but this would give them access to some of the knowledge that Rome has thus far built up, something that would easily become a liability if any were to rise against Rome or find their interests aligned with her enemies. Assimilation of the Germans would still really be slow and not completely successful. The cost of maintaining Germania Magna could easily lead to debates in the Senate about withdrawing back to the Rhine, a proposal that would likely be rejected due to the region's iron and coal deposits. Slowly, Rome will simply stagnate and weaken. An empire that can't necessarily fall from the outside, but will likely divide itself by competing interest from within, allowing its far reaches to be abandoned, its technology looted but not necessarily replicated, and its interior simply competing with one another in a complex industrial trade system more suited to the new Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire will not have fallen at all. Far from it, actually. And Rome itself as a legal entity would likely survive in Italy and Hispania. But the political systems, the technology, the language, the culture, the religion, art, architecture, the sheer physical and economic impact of Rome's massive walls and canals and railways and trade networks would be imprinted upon the Mediterranean world. A world of now competing powers. Syria, Gaul, Britannia, Rome, Thracia, Egyptus, Africa, Scythia, Dacia, Franconia, Belgica, Persia, Nabatea, Nubia, Pontus, and more. The Silk Road would remain open, trade would continue through the Indian Ocean, innovation and trade, language and schooling would still persist, but would now be undertaken by smaller remnants of this once continent-spanning empire. One that would inspire each piece of the Mediterranean world to make itself worthy of the title of successor to Rome. And who knows, maybe someday, should the Arab tribes conquer the Sassanid Empire and attack the mighty defenses of Syria and Nabatea and Judea, perhaps a lowly fleet from Britannia or Hispania will set off for the west in search of new routes to continue trade with the east, and maybe, just maybe, one will come upon a vast landmass, not Thule, but something else, something lush, rich in mineral wealth, ripe for conquest and industry. A new world, to plant the red banner upon, to build temples and massive marble statues and fortified ports and railroads and mines. A new world, Terra Occidentalis, the continent of Augustus. But that's where I'll be leaving this scenario for today. As always, let me know what you think will happen next. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us by joining our Discord or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.